Hey guys, tonight we step barefoot into the gritty, moss-covered world of medieval justice, where punishment was as creative as it was cruel. And sexual crimes, well, they got some of the most peculiar treatment of all. Imagine the cold cobblestones of a village square pressing into your soles, the rusted creak of iron restraints closing around your wrists, and a small but smug crowd gathering to witness your humiliation. The scent of boiled cabbage hangs heavy in the air, mingling with the faint whiff of livestock and something worse. Someone just handed a child a rotten apple, and it's not for lunch. You're about to be locked into the stocks. This won't kill you, probably. But you'll come to realize that death isn't the only medieval deterrent. Sometimes a bruised ego and a sunburned nose were the preferred flavor of justice. You probably won't survive this week without at least one bad case of trench foot. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from your bed, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The stocks, in their humble wooden simplicity, were a favorite tool of both townspeople and local magistrates. Positioned usually in the center of town, strategically placed for maximum foot traffic, they consisted of a hinged wooden frame with holes for your ankles, sometimes your hands too. Once secured, you're basically a medieval mannequin, forced to sit upright, exposed to the weather, and here's the real punishment: the locals. The idea wasn't just physical restraint, it was visibility. Your sin was literally on display, and so were you. Committing adultery, fornication, or even lewd conduct with someone you weren't married to could land you right here. Your name would often be announced ahead of time by the town crier, just in case anyone wanted to bring spoiled cabbage or crusty bread from the back of the pantry. Now, here's the kicker. Punishments were doled out differently based on your gender, your status, and sometimes just how the magistrate felt that day. Women caught in compromising situations were sometimes stripped to the waist or had their hair shorn publicly, a double blow of shame and cold air. Men might have a sign around their necks reading lech, fornicator, or the medieval equivalent of thirsty. In Latin, of course, because shame sounds fancier that way. Historians still argue whether the stocks were more symbolic than effective. After all, some chroniclers claimed villagers grew fond of regular stock guests and even brought them ale. But for first-timers like you, not so fun, especially if it rains, especially if it snows, especially if Jeffrey from the bakery decides to spit on you again. There are records from Kent and Yorkshire that mention people being left in stocks for up to 3 days. That's 3 days of no bathroom breaks, no sleep, and no escape from toddlers poking you with sticks. And let's not forget, lice. They love this kind of situation. So do rats. And what about the night? Well, the stocks don't magically disappear at sunset. You're left to doze sitting upright, praying that local teenagers don't get creative with torches and goose feathers. A few places allowed friends or family to bring you food, but even that was up to the whim of the town constable. Some let folks toss bread, others just tossed opinions. Curiously, there are anecdotes, some more folklore than fact, of particularly charming or attractive offenders becoming small-time celebrities while locked in. One tale from 14th century Devon speaks of a traveling bard who was punished for songs too saucy. Townswomen allegedly brought him wine and poems of their own, and he reportedly left the village with more admirers than bruises. Don't get any ideas. In one bizarre case in Lincolnshire, a woman was locked into a stock-like device that held her upright, not for her crime, but because her accuser wanted to read scripture to her for 12 hours straight as penance. Even the magistrate reportedly said, "Let it not become habit." Spoiler, it did. You notice a chicken staring at you. It's pecking the mud near your feet, completely unbothered by your suffering. A child asks if he can paint your nose red. His mother shrugs. You begin to suspect that your actual punishment isn't the stocks themselves, but how quickly people adapt to your presence in them. By the second day, your legs ache in strange medieval ways. The blood rushes down. You feel every splinter. You're developing the kind of disdain for turnip throwers that will haunt your dreams. And the worst part? This is the gentlest punishment you'll receive in the story. So settle in, get cozy under the blankets, and remember, at least you get to move your feet tonight. You're wobbly when they finally let you out of the stocks. Your feet are pins and needles. Your pride is somewhere near the cabbage cart. And the bruises on your thighs will tell this story longer than your voice ever will. But you're free now, or so you think. Unfortunately, your little escapade, or let's call it your moment of poor judgment involving the miller's nephew, has made it into the town records. And because this is the Middle Ages, there's a little bonus punishment waiting for you. Branding. Now, you might think of branding as something reserved for cattle or rowdy criminals, but in certain corners of medieval Europe, sexual offenders were given very literal marks of shame. A hot iron pressed against skin, leaving a letter or sometimes a whole word, etched into flesh like a medieval Yelp review. You're marched into the magistrate's chamber, which smells like ink, old vellum, and something distressingly metallic. A brazier glows red in the corner, heating irons shaped into letters. You try not to make eye contact with the iron shaped like an F. You're hoping it stands for forgiven. It does not. In 13th century England and France, it wasn't uncommon for convicted adulterers or repeat fornicators to be branded on the cheek, shoulder, or even hand. The French, never once to shy from flair, occasionally added a flourish to the letter. And yes, some letters stood for Latin phrases. There was F for fornicatus, A for adulterium, and in rare German territories, a K standing for kupolai or pimping. If your crime involved arranging a rendezvous, even just as a favor, guess what? You're in trouble too. The smell of burning flesh is hard to describe. It's not just pain, it's permanence. You clench your jaw. The iron comes close. It's worse than the pain of the heat. It's the knowledge that every time you try to blend into a crowd from now on, someone will look at your face, or your hand, and know. Some towns gave a choice. You could take the brand, or lose your right ear. Others weren't so generous. And if you were clergy caught in a scandal? Sometimes the branding was done in secret, hidden under the robes, whispered away as penance. Historians still argue whether branding was meant more for punishment or deterrence. Some say it marked you permanently as a sinner. Others believe it was a way for communities to monitor repeat offenders. What's clear is that there was no medieval HR department advocating for proportional justice. There's a case from Florence in the 14th century involving a pair of lovers. One a married merchant's wife, the other a young apprentice. They were both caught in an attic under what the court transcript delicately called compromising textiles. She was branded on the shoulder, he on the buttocks. Equal crime, different canvas. And here's a quirk for your dreams tonight. Branding irons weren't always made of metal. In parts of rural Wales and Bohemia, they used carved wood, pressed while still hot from the hearth. The scar it left faded over time, unless someone added ash or wine to the wound to make it last longer. A few local healers even offered secret salves to soften or erase the scar, though getting caught using them was another punishable offense. So yes, even medieval tattoo removal came with risks. You shift in your chair now, the memory of hot iron ghosting across your skin. The clerk who held your arm during the branding offered you a lemon wedge to bite. Very thoughtful. Very ineffective. And branding wasn't always about guilt. In some places, particularly along certain Eastern European trade routes, branding was used as a precaution. Women thought to be prostitutes, or even just unmarried women traveling alone, could be branded in advance as a kind of moral insurance policy. It was supposed to protect others from temptation. You can imagine how well that worked. Of course, the wealthy had options: a fine, a quiet confession, a relocation, maybe even a letter of indulgence if the church was in a generous mood. But for commoners like you, the skin told the story. You were the book everyone could read without opening. By now, the blister is swelling. They've bound it in cloth and rubbed something on it that smells like beeswax and regret. Someone mutters a prayer. You nod, not listening. You leave the chamber, and as you pass through the doorway, you catch your reflection in a polished brass bowl. The letter is faint, but it's there. Tomorrow, it'll be darker. People will notice. People will whisper. You start to wonder if that stock seat was the kinder fate after all, but don't worry. There are still plenty of medieval punishments to come. Some hurt the body, some hurt the soul, and a few hurt your fashion sense. So, you've worn the stocks. You've been seared by an iron letter that now declares your intimate history to every nosy neighbor in a 3-village radius. But just when you think medieval justice can't get any more invasive, someone in your local court reaches for a belt. But not just any belt. This one comes with a lock, a myth, a reputation, and a name whispered with both titillation and skepticism by modern historians. The chastity belt. Now let's clear something up from the start. Historians still argue whether chastity belts were genuinely used in the Middle Ages, or if they're mostly the stuff of Renaissance imagination and 19th century museum hoaxes. Some believe they were symbolic objects, more theatrical threat than everyday device. Others claim there were rare cases, particularly among the nobility, where they were actually fitted and fastened before a husband rode off to war or just into town with trust issues. Still, for you, standing awkwardly in the corner of the bailiff's office while someone fumbles with a key the size of a turkey leg, this debate feels pretty irrelevant. Because here it is. Cold. Iron. With a faint floral pattern hammered into the waist piece. How charming. The device has a simple design, a metal belt around the waist with a modesty panel, let's call it that, stretching between the legs, complete with small ventilation holes and the undeniable air of pure discomfort. Theoretically, it prevents any indecent contact, whether from outside forces or your own rebellious fingers. The belt is locked, the key held by a husband, father, guardian, or magistrate. You just get to wear it. Let's talk logistics. Medieval hygiene, as you may recall, was already a dicey affair. Now imagine going about your day, fetching water, herding goats, attending mass, with a clunky hunk of iron chafing your thighs. You better hope for good undergarments and no urgent need to run. One Fringe account, possibly exaggerated, tells of a young noblewoman in northern Italy who wore a chastity belt during her fiancé's pilgrimage. When he returned after 6 months, he found the key had rusted, and a local blacksmith had to be summoned. The tale ends with their marriage, but presumably not with a spa honeymoon. The very idea of the chastity belt, however dubious its day-to-day use, is what mattered most in the medieval mindset. It was a symbol of control, specifically male control over female sexuality. Whether locked on by a suspicious husband or threatened as punishment for an unruly maid, it existed more as a warning than a widespread wardrobe staple. In some rare ecclesiastical records, priests reportedly recommended something belt-like for young women with wandering thoughts. What that actually entailed is still debated, but some scholars believe it could have been cloth, leather, or even bone. Less armor, more psychological deterrent. But there are darker twists. In certain regions, especially later in the medieval period, chastity belts were reportedly used not to protect women's virtue, but to punish perceived promiscuity or tempting behavior. Picture being marched to the town square in one, not for safety, but as a walking billboard of shame. Women accused of enticing men or engaging in repeat offenses were, according to some court transcripts, made to wear modified belts in public. Even if the device wasn't locked, the statement was clear. You were being muzzled below the waist. In one unusually detailed case from the archives of Avignon, a woman named Isabeau was forced to wear a leather chastity harness with bramble sewn to the inside. She was accused of seducing 3 different monks, though she insisted they'd seduced her. The punishment, it seems, wasn't about justice. It was about spectacle. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some 19th century chastity belts once displayed in museums were later debunked as fakes, created not in the 1400s but in the 1800s by overzealous collectors with too much brass and not enough common sense. One belt, now widely considered a hoax, even featured a built-in lock mechanism that could only be opened by singing a specific Latin chant. Imagine forgetting the lyrics. You shift uncomfortably now. The belt they've given you today has no musical features, just chafing, sweat, and the constant clink of metal whenever you move. You walk with short, robotic steps, like someone trying not to wake a sleeping badger taped to their thighs. Your neighbors don't quite make eye contact. The village dogs, however, are very interested. The magistrate has given you 2 days in this contraption. Let it be a reminder, he says, of the sanctity of the flesh. You suspect it will mostly remind you of how much you miss woolen trousers. And there's one more wrinkle. Keys. In some places, these belts came with 2 keys. One for the guardian, and one for the church. Which begs the question, who checks in on the checker? Who gets to decide when you've earned your freedom? You'd ask, but it's hard to yell indignantly when you're waddling like a rusty duck. So you return to your chores, your dignity somewhere behind the cowshed, the belt digging into your skin like a moral compass with spikes. You start counting the hours, then the minutes. You whisper prayers. You compose imaginary letters to future archaeologists, begging them not to believe everything they find. And eventually the belt comes off. Not with a grand ceremony, not with a lesson learned, but with a creak, a hiss of rusted metal, and the kind of relief that brings actual tears to your eyes. You feel like you can breathe again. Not just physically, existentially. You vow never to complain about tight laces again. Little do you know, your troubles are far from over. You may be free of the belt, but the village gossips are just getting warmed up. Freedom feels strange. After 2 days in that infernal belt, your skin is tender, your temper thinner than oat gruel, and your gait still a bit clockwork. But at least it's off. You breathe, stretch, scratch, carefully, and vow to keep a low profile for the foreseeable future. No more spontaneous flirtations. No more lingering glances across the market stalls. You are a new person. A chaste, unenticing, belt-free version of yourself. And then you're summoned. You assume it's another fine, maybe a scolding. But no. This time, the magistrate wants a confession. Not to a priest, not to God, to the public. You've been selected for a lovely little ritual called the Penance Parade. Now, these weren't unique to sexual crimes, but they were popular for them. Whether it was fornication, adultery, or the all-purpose charge of unchaste conduct, communities loved a good old-fashioned walk of shame, with properties and chanting, and the entire town watching like it's the Sunday mummers play, only spicier. You are handed a robe. It's sackcloth, itchy, heavy, and probably made from whatever was left in the corner of the abbey's storage room. There's a rope belt for dramatic flair, and a signboard hung around your neck with your crime scribbled in paint. You check the spelling, out of habit. It's correct. Of course it is. Then comes the part you really didn't expect. You're barefoot. In January. The street stones are cold enough to make your toes weep. You shuffle forward, clutching the confession scroll you're expected to read at various intervals. The crowd gathers quickly. Old women with baskets, children giggling, 2 blacksmiths taking a break just to watch. Someone throws a turnip. It misses, barely. This isn't just about punishment, it's about pageantry. In the Middle Ages, justice was theater. The idea was to purge not just your soul, but the town's collective conscience. By watching you suffer, they felt cleansed. It was weirdly communal, like an early version of reality TV, but with more fasting and fewer confessional interviews. You trudge through the square, voice cracking as you recite your misdeed. I laid with a man not my husband. A gasp from someone who definitely did the same last winter after too much mead. In Spain, these parades were sometimes called auto de fe, act of faith, though those were more famously used for heresy. In your case, the term used is a bit more rustic, parada de la vergüenza, or shame walk. In France, it might be amende honorable, where the penitent knelt in front of a church with a torch in one hand and a noose around their neck. Symbolic, of course. Usually. Now for your quirky tidbit. In parts of rural Saxony, the accused sometimes had to wear special horned hats to signify cuckoldry or promiscuity. They were bright red. Velvet if you were lucky. Straw if you weren't. And in Venice, there's a record of adulterers being forced to carry live geese as they walked. Supposedly to draw attention, though the geese may have just been comic relief. Historians still argue whether these punishments were more about repentance or spectacle. Some argue the church viewed them as genuine spiritual cleansings. Others suggest civic leaders used them as distractions, public humiliation to keep citizens too busy gossiping to rebel. You try to walk with dignity, it doesn't work. A patch of mud takes down your left foot. Your scroll flutters. The child snatches it, reads the word fornicator, and laughs like he's just discovered the meaning of life. The worst part? You know most of these people. That's your old schoolmaster over there, shaking his head. That's your cousin pretending not to see you. That's the baker who definitely tried to kiss you behind the granary 3 summers ago. You almost want to shout, "At least I was caught." The parade ends at the church steps. You kneel. You recite a final prayer. You're forgiven. Officially. Spiritually, but not socially. Oh no. You'll be the star of village gossip for months, maybe longer. Sometimes the punishment included an overnight vigil. You'd sit in the nave under candlelight, surrounded by images of saints who all look vaguely disappointed. You'd fast, reflect, and try not to fall asleep, because if you did, someone would nudge you with a stick or a sandal. There's a quiet power in this kind of punishment. It doesn't scar the body, unless you count frostbite on your feet, but it seeps into the bones. It turns every door you walk past into a whisper, every market stall into a memory. But you survive it. You go home, peel off the sackcloth, soak your feet, and dream of anonymity. And then the village artist paints a mural. Not of you directly, but of a certain sinner doing a penance parade. And wouldn't you know it, she has your nose. You'd think after the stocks, the iron belt, and a barefoot humiliation march through your hometown, things might calm down. They do not. Because in certain corners of medieval Europe, especially the ones with a stronger ecclesiastical grip, sexual sin wasn't just a civic issue, it was a spiritual infection. And once you were infected, the only cure, besides shame and a steady diet of porridge, was penance. Long, prolonged, punishing penance. So now you're being sent to a moral retreat. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? But don't start imagining vineyards and emotional journaling. This is penitent exile, also known as enforced seclusion. And it often meant you'd be packed off to a remote convent, monastic grange, or even a makeshift isolation hut, depending on the severity of your transgression and the wealth of your family. In your case, it's a tiny stone building, half a day's walk outside town, watched over by a rather stern widow who's been given the charming title of Guardian of Virtue. You are to remain here for 40 days. The exact number may have been lifted from biblical precedent, or perhaps just pulled from the same hat as other favorite punishments. Either way, it's long enough for rumors to multiply and for your social standing to quietly wither. There are rules, of course. Wake before sunrise. Pray 6 times daily. 2 meals, no meat. Silence unless spoken to. And no idle hands, so you'll spend most of your day spinning wool, mending sackcloth, or writing biblical verses in charcoal on scraps of bark. This practice wasn't just symbolic. Some church records show detailed registries of women, and occasionally men, sent into seclusion for various offenses, from adultery to premarital tryst to just being tempting. The goal was spiritual detox. You were to stew in your thoughts, contemplate sin, and emerge somehow reborn, or at least a little less interested in flirting. But here's the quirky part. Some penitents, especially those with noble ties, actually liked the quiet. One 14th century French countess reportedly requested an extension of her moral exile because it gave her an excuse to avoid courtly politics. She eventually turned her hut into a kind of rustic reading room and refused to leave even when absolved. You, however, are not enjoying this. The widow is snoring in the corner, your knees ache from cold stone, and the stew is mostly turnips. You try to think spiritual thoughts, but mostly think about bread and warmth, and how itchy your shift has become. Every few days, a priest visits to check in. He sits across from you, always the same questions. Have you reflected? Do you feel remorse? You nod. Of course you do. You say exactly what they want to hear. You even throw in a Latin phrase for good measure, mea culpa. Big eyes, hands folded, practiced humility. Historians still debate whether these periods of seclusion were sincere attempts at reform or merely a tidy way to hide scandal. Some argue that isolating sinners protected community harmony. Others suggest it served mostly to break people down emotionally until they were too weary to sin again. There's also the rumor that such retreats weren't always so chaste. One nun-turned-historian, centuries later, discovered old journal entries hinting that some of these exile houses became meeting spots for discreet affairs. 2 penitents, 1 lantern, and very little oversight. But that's a different story. For you, the only company is a stray cat and the occasional passing goat. And then, just when you've memorized every crack in the wall and started naming the spiders, you're released. No parade this time. No grand ceremony. Just a quiet knock at dawn, a bundle of old clothes, and a terse, "Go in peace." The widow doesn't even wave. You walk back into the village feeling like a ghost. People glance but don't greet. A baker pretends not to see you. A child whispers something and giggles. You're not a person anymore, not really. You're a cautionary tale. But here's the irony. While you've been doing penance, someone else in the village has been caught with a shepherd behind the stables. Another soul to parade, to exile, to whisper about. And so the wheel turns. You sit in your cottage that night, alone, the fire low. You press your palm to the hearth's warm stones and think, not about sin or scripture or what comes next. You think about how quiet it is, how that silence doesn't feel peaceful anymore. Of course, silence doesn't last long. Word travels fast in medieval towns, especially when it concerns scandal. And while your own escapade is slowly being folded into the village's long memory of other juicy tales, the church isn't quite done with you yet. Because now it's time for a visit from the archdeacon's clerk. He's thin, pale, and suspiciously cheerful. Think of a medieval tax auditor with a fondness for parchment and passive aggression. He arrives with a tiny leather satchel full of scrolls, a portable inkwell, and a disturbingly fast quill. He says he's here for your moral inventory. You nod slowly, as if that explains anything. You're handed a wooden tablet, yes, a literal tablet, waxed and rewritable, and asked to write down all previous sins. Just the relevant ones, he adds, which somehow makes it worse. You sit down, awkwardly gripping the stylus, and wonder if thinking about the tanner's apprentice while weaving counts. You write it anyway. Honesty, after all, is next to godliness. What you've just encountered is part of a medieval system known in some regions as the sin register. These were particularly popular in parts of Italy, France, and the German-speaking Holy Roman Empire. While mostly ecclesiastical in nature, local lords often got a peek. Because if you were sinning, you probably weren't tithing properly either. The church kept notes. Oh, so many notes. What's curious, though, is that these records weren't always for punishment. In some cases, they were a form of social control. If you confessed preemptively, you might receive lighter penance. Think of it as an ancient version of self-reporting. There's even documentation of people trying to outdo each other in their confessions. One young man in Milan allegedly claimed to have impure thoughts every hour just to get more frequent spiritual attention. Bless his heart. Now here's your quirky tidbit. In 13th century Norway, there was a bizarre clerical debate over whether lustful dreams counted as sins. One priest argued that if the dreamer enjoyed it, it was spiritually close enough. Another countered that since one couldn't consent while sleeping, dreams were exempt. Historians still chuckle over the minutes of that particular council meeting. Back in your cottage, the clerk finishes scribbling down your testimony. He folds the scroll, seals it with a blob of wax, and adds it to his growing pile. Then he says something that chills your already chilled bones. There may be a tribunal. Tribunal. The word lands like a stone in your stomach. Now, to be clear, we're not talking about Inquisition-level drama here. Those were mostly for heresy, and you haven't exactly been preaching Gnostic secrets or challenging papal authority. Just the occasional sinful flirtation. But smaller moral tribunals, often held by local bishops or cathedral chapters, were very real. And for sexual crimes, they tended to be imaginative. Sometimes you'd be summoned to stand trial in front of an ecclesiastical panel, usually older men in robes who always smelled faintly of damp vellum. Other times it was a private affair, one-on-one questioning, with a scribe, in a dark chamber somewhere near the rectory. Either way, there'd be questions. Many, many questions. Do you admit to the act? Did you feel remorse during or only after? Were there witnesses? Did you tempt him, or did he tempt you? You imagine what you'll say, what you'll leave out, what they already know. You start rehearsing lines in your head. I was weak. The devil whispered. It was a moment of human frailty. Maybe even throw in a tear. Historians still argue whether these tribunals were sincere spiritual interventions or theatrical power plays. Some believe they aimed to maintain communal order by naming and shaming. Others say they were mostly administrative, meant to keep the church's books tidy and its authority intact. You prepare for the worst. But then curiously, nothing happens. Days pass, then weeks. No summons, no tribunal, no second sin audit. The archdeacon's clerk is spotted in another town, sniffing through someone else's laundry. You are forgotten, or at least pushed down the list. You begin to wonder, was it mercy? A clerical error? A new scandal bumping you off the docket? Or maybe, just maybe, they think you've learned your lesson. Which is funny, because you're not sure you have. You still think about him, the one who started all this. Not with bitterness, not even with regret. Just curiosity. You wonder where he is, if he was punished, if he remembers your face. You go to bed, pull the wool blanket up to your chin, and trace the cracks in your cottage ceiling like constellations. One looks vaguely like a pelican, another unsettlingly like the chastity belt. You breathe, you sleep, but tomorrow you hear there's talk of another woman. Caught with a monk, in the bell tower. The wheel turns again. You wake to gossip, carried on the morning bread run. The baker's apprentice, who, let's be honest, has never been good at whispering, tells the blacksmith's daughter, who tells the tanner's son, who tells everyone else. They caught the widow's niece with a traveling monk, in the bell tower of all places. It's scandalous, of course, but more than that, it's thrilling. You feel it ripple through the village like the flick of a silk hemline in church. People lean in closer, eyes squint with curiosity. Conversations now begin with, "Did you hear about? You're off the hook." Temporarily. But it does make you think about monks and nuns and what happened when they couldn't keep their vows. Because here's the thing no one likes to admit. Despite all the holy oaths, medieval monasteries and nunneries were far from immune to human temptation. Some were devout, others, less so. You can't help but imagine it now. A shy glance exchanged during Vespers. a chance meeting by the herb garden. And suddenly, boom, scandal. When monks and nuns were caught engaging in sexual acts, punishments varied wildly depending on the order, the wealth of the institution, and yes, gender. For male monks, the penalties could range from fasting and isolation to being defrocked, stripped of their clerical robes and booted out into the world like sheep without shepherds. For nuns, the consequences were often harsher. You picture her, a young nun in a white coif, trembling before the abbess, accused of falling for a visiting friar. What would they do? Lock her in a small cell? Shave her head? Banish her to some remote priory where the wind always howls and the food always smells faintly of mildew? In some places, especially across northern France and England, nuns were sentenced to what was called perpetual enclosure. This meant no more community meals, no more shared prayer. Just a single candlelit room behind bars where meals were passed through a slot, and confession came once a week through a whispering grill. Yet not all monastic romances ended so grimly. There's one case from 14th century Bohemia of a monk and nun who fled together, stole horses, and tried to live as a married couple under assumed names. It took nearly a year for the church to track them down. When caught, the monk repented so passionately he was allowed back into his order. The nun, however, was sentenced to lifelong silence. Historians still argue whether this silence was literal or symbolic. Was she forbidden to speak altogether, or merely denied spiritual counsel? Either way, the message was clear: fall, and you fall alone. There's a fringe theory, whispered in more rebellious corners of medieval studies, that some abbots quietly allowed romantic entanglements in exchange for political favors. One priory in Lombardy reportedly ignored several nunnery intrusions because the local bishop's nephew was involved. A few extra sheep for the winter and everyone looks the other way. And then there's the infamous case of the double monastery, an institution that housed both monks and nuns in separate quarters, usually under the leadership of an abbess. The theory was noble: shared resources, mutual prayer, spiritual balance. In practice? Well, let's just say the garden walls weren't always as tall as the architects intended. You think of them now. Those restless souls in their robes and sandals, torn between duty and desire. How many sat awake at night like you, tracing patterns on stone ceilings, wondering if holiness and humanity could ever coexist? A bell tolls in the distance. Not the scandalous one, just the town's midday chime. You stretch, bake a flat loaf. Ponder the possibility of entering a convent, not out of repentance but for the quiet, the structure, the lack of gossiping neighbors. But then you remember the widow's niece, the traveling monk, and the bell tower. Maybe the quiet isn't all it's cracked up to be. Just when you think you've heard every variety of penance and scandal, someone mentions Spain. Not the warm, romantic Spain of embroidered fans and Moorish palaces. No, this is ecclesiastical Spain, where the line between religious law and civil punishment was often thinner than the hem of a bishop's oib. And today's tale begins with something deceptively gentle. A parade. Except you're not watching it, you're in it. Barefoot, head bowed, wearing a long, heavy robe dyed the color of ash. In your hands, a thick candle dripping slowly onto your wrist as the sun beats down. People line the streets, whispering. Some make the sign of the cross, others just stare. This is the auto de fe, literally the act of faith. And while most people associate it with the Spanish Inquisition, there's a lesser-known version practiced earlier and on a smaller scale for more mundane sins like adultery, fornication, or public indecency. And tonight, dear sleeper, you're the opening act. Your crime? A tryst behind the church with a visiting notary. You'd think that'd be small potatoes in a world of wars and plagues. But no. The bishop's assistant saw you, and here you are, on public display, performing repentance with every aching step. And if you were in 13th century Aragon, there might even be live music. Small bands sometimes accompanied these processions, turning them into half penance, half performance. Imagine a lute playing a slow, somber tune while villagers toss barley and mutter prayers. Somewhere, a child giggles. You resist the urge to giggle too. These acts were partly theater, designed not just to punish the offender, but to impress upon the crowd the dangers of temptation. You walk for what feels like hours, ending at the church steps, where you kneel and recite your sins. A priest reads your penance aloud. The crowd disperses. No applause, just mutters and shifting feet. But that's not the end. After the public humiliation comes the San Bonito, a special garment you're required to wear for weeks, sometimes months. Picture a tunic, roughly stitched, usually yellow or off-white, emblazoned with crosses or flames. The design varied by region, but the effect was always the same. Everyone knew what you'd done. What's particularly fascinating is how official this all became. Church records in parts of Spain kept detailed logs of who wore which robe, for how long, and for what offense. In some parishes, they even created punishment tiers, with specific San Bonito symbols reserved for repeat offenders. And here's your quirky fact of the night. In one documented case from Valencia, a woman caught having an affair with a Moorish servant was sentenced to wear a robe depicting two birds kissing, stitched in bright red thread. It was meant to mock her, but historians suspect she wore it with a certain defiant pride. You think about that woman now, marching under the hot sun, fabric scratching at her skin, jaw clenched as neighbors titter behind her. Was she ashamed? Or quietly daring anyone to look her in the eye? Historians still debate whether these punishments were effective deterrents or just creative cruelty. Some suggest they backfired, creating martyrs out of sinners and reinforcing taboos through repetition. Others argue they kept communities in check during times of social strain, especially when religious boundaries were fragile. And boundaries were fragile in Spain, especially during the complex coexistence of Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Interfaith relationships were not just discouraged, they were dangerous. A Christian woman seen consorting with a Jewish merchant might be punished not only for fornication, but for endangering the faith. Layered sins, layered shame? You return home, the hem of your robe catching every thistle and muddy patch along the way. You pass familiar faces. No one speaks, but you sense the heat of their glances. Inside, you hang the San Bonito on a hook by the door. It's damp with sweat and humiliation. You wonder how long you'll have to wear it. A fortnight? A month? The candle you carried during the parade sits on your windowsill, wax cooling in strange curls. You light it again, out of habit. The flame dances. For a moment, it almost looks like two birds kissing. You chuckle, quietly, rebelliously. Because if you're going to be punished for love, at least let it be for something worthwhile. You would think after the parade of shame and the itchy robe and the very public candle of regret, that your slate might be wiped clean. But medieval justice, especially where sexuality is concerned, is like a stew left too long on the fire. It thickens, it lingers. It starts to smell like something more permanent. Enter the relic taxes, that's right. You may have repented, confessed, and baked 100 apology loaves for the poor, but if your local church boasts a prized relic, say a finger bone of a saint, or the embroidered veil of a virgin martyr, you might be expected to pay a small fee to touch it. Spiritually speaking, of course. The logic? Relics were considered powerful spiritual mediators. If you had sinned in any particularly juicy or biblically scandalous way, you could offer coin, or, in some regions, livestock or grain, in exchange for a few seconds of divine contact. One brief brush of your fingers against a silver-plated reliquary, and voila! Some of that heavenly goodness would hopefully rub off on you. Your village has a toe. Not just any toe, St. Modesta's. Preserved in a little glass capsule, nestled in the wall behind the altar, surrounded by dried lavender and flickering votives. She's the patron saint of chastity, of course. Naturally. And wouldn't you know it, your name just came up on the access list. You trudge to the church, clutching 2 hens under your arm, payment in kind since your purse is still light from the candle parade. The priest greets you with a solemn nod, then gestures to the reliquary. You kneel, you wait. He recites a few Latin phrases, then dramatically unveils the toe. It's very toe-like. You close your eyes and press your forehead to the glass. For a moment, you wonder if you should feel different. Holier, cleaner. Mostly, you just feel cold, and vaguely like you're about to sneeze. Still, box checked. Penance, in its many medieval forms, is a mosaic. Public, private, symbolic, and sometimes strangely transactional. Now, for a fringe tale that historians still squabble over. In 14th century Burgundy, there's a record, perhaps apocryphal, of a woman who faked possession in order to avoid punishment for adultery. She rolled on the floor during Mass, screamed in Latin, which she likely didn't know, and claimed a demon made her do it. The local priest, baffled but desperate for an explanation, prescribed a visit to 3 different relics across the region. She obliged, dramatically writhing at each stop. In the end, the charges were dropped. Historians still argue whether she was clever, genuinely afflicted, or just really committed to the bit. Back in your own little parish, relic tourism isn't exactly thrilling, but it is routine. And profitable. People come from nearby towns to glimpse St. Modesta's toe. The church sells small medallions with her likeness. Children receive chastity tokens shaped like acorns. The irony is rich. You take your token anyway. It's made of lead and smells faintly of incense and old pews. Outside, the air feels different. Or maybe you do. Lighter, number, but rebalanced until you spot Brother Alain, the notary's assistant, the one with the good shoes and the surprisingly wicked smile. He's walking toward the butcher's stall, completely ignoring the haughty looks thrown his way. Somehow, he's still employed, still clean-faced, no candle, no robe, no toe taxes. Your eye twitches slightly, because here's the thing. While you've walked barefoot through town, paraded in shame, and practically curtsied to a mummified digit, he has done nothing, and you're not alone. All across medieval Europe, women bore the brunt of sexual punishment. Whether through religious penance, civil fines, or sheer social stigma, the scales were rarely balanced. Male offenders, especially those with status or connections, were often led off with a warning, a confession, a discreet transfer to another parish. Historians still debate whether this imbalance was doctrinal or cultural. After all, church law technically held both parties equally responsible for sexual sin. But the reality on the muddy, gossipy ground, very different. You stand in the square holding your chastity acorn like a paperweight of regret, and you wonder, what would happen if next time you just walked away? No confession, no candle, no toe, just a slow smile, and a very good pair of shoes. Rain taps gently on your thatch roof tonight, soft and steady, like a monk's knuckles on a confessional door. You lie back, tracing the cracks in the ceiling with your eyes, thinking not of your own misadventures for once, but of someone else. Someone whose punishment makes even your parade of shame look like a birthday party. Her name is Marjorie. Not that Marjorie, there were about 100 of them in every village, but this one's different. This Marjorie was accused not of adultery, but of being a temptress, a seducer. The kind of woman people whispered about even before she did anything. Just suspiciously unrepentant. And so Marjorie was sentenced to the bridal. You shudder. The scold's bridle, or branks, as it was sometimes called in England and Scotland, was a metal contraption placed over the head, with a tongue plate that pressed down inside the mouth. It was originally intended for nagging women, gossips, or disruptive wives, but it was also used, less often but notably for women accused of sexual deviance, especially those whose sin involved seducing good Christian men into scandal. You picture it now. Rusted iron, hinged jaw, a mouthpiece that made speech painful, if not impossible. Sometimes it was decorated cruelly with little horns or bells to draw even more attention, as if the punishment needed any. Marjorie, according to surviving records from 15th century York, was made to wear one while tethered to a post in the town square. She stood there all afternoon, drool running down her chin, while a priest recited passages about Eve and temptation. Children pointed. Women looked away. Men? Some looked a little too long. Was she guilty? Or just too confident? Too outspoken? Too willing to smile in public? Historians still argue whether the bridal was widely used or simply symbolic, a kind of medieval urban myth employed more as a threat than a regular punishment. But several branks survive in museums, with wear patterns that suggest otherwise. They weren't just for show, and they weren't the only tools of humiliation. In parts of Germany and the Low Countries, women accused of being lustful could be forced to wear shame masks, grotesque iron faces with exaggerated features like long noses or animal ears, each supposedly tailored to the nature of their sin. A donkey nose for foolishness, a pig snout for gluttony, lips curled in mock seduction for... well, you get the idea. You imagine walking through the village square like that, the clank of every step, the mask cold against your skin, the way people pretended not to stare while staring all the same. And if you were lucky, that was all. In harsher regions, or in particularly moralistic townships, the punishment might include being paraded through the streets with your skirt pinned up, or your head shaved. In Italy, there's a record of a woman accused of enticing priests who was forced to walk barefoot through 7 churches, holding a candle and a sign that read, "Temptress of the Cloth." There's something especially medieval about this obsession with symbolic penalties. Not physical torture, not imprisonment, but a public reminder crafted like a performance. A morality play in which the sinner plays the lead role, surrounded by villagers who murmur their lines of judgment right on cue. You shift under your blanket, unsettled. Not frightened exactly, just unnerved by how elaborate it all was. How inventive, how committed. And here's a delicious little fringe theory for your sleep-starved mind. In one dusty manuscript from southern France, there's a note scribbled in the margin by a bored monk cataloging punishments. Next to a sketch of a shame mask, he wrote, "Used sparingly." Villagers found it entertaining. Entertainment. That's the word that catches you. Because under all the scripture and sanctimony, these punishments often blurred the line between discipline and spectacle. Between justice and theater. You wonder, in a half-dreamy sort of way, if the people watching these spectacles ever realized how close they were to starring in one. Maybe that's why the punishments were so dramatic, to distract the crowd from their own precarious virtue. A wind rattles the shutters. A dog barks twice, then falls silent. You picture Marjorie again, standing in the rain, iron bridle glinting, eyes locked on the sky. Maybe she cried. Maybe she didn't. Maybe she simply waited, knowing this too would pass, knowing the gossip would shift by market day. And maybe, just maybe, someone watched her from a window. Not with mockery, but with quiet awe. You smiled, Nenen, because even in a world obsessed with obedience, there was always someone, somewhere, who saw defiance and thought, now that's a woman worth remembering. It's nearly midnight now, and the rain has slowed to a gentle mist, like the sky itself is whispering secrets. You close your eyes and suddenly you're not in your own village anymore. You're in Bohemia. The year is 1396, and the punishment is unusually musical. Tonight's tale opens with a flute. Not just any flute. This one is carved from deer bone, polished smooth, and played expertly by a man named Lucas, who was unfortunately caught in a delicate situation with the miller's wife. Now, instead of playing taverns and weddings, Lucas plays from a wooden cage suspended above the town square. Yes, suspended. A punishment known in parts of Central Europe as der Luftkäfig, or the air cage. Essentially a wooden or iron structure hoisted several feet above the ground, left to sway in the breeze like a birdcage full of scandal. Those sentenced would be placed inside for hours or even days, depending on the severity of their offense. And in Lucas's case, the town council decided that since he was known for making people dance, he might as well provide background music while atoning for his sins. So here he is, barefoot, sleepless, flute to his lips, as curious villagers gather to listen. A man in a cage playing tunes that once made people blush for entirely different reasons. The irony? He sounds amazing. You hum along quietly. Somewhere in the dreamscape you can almost hear it. These elevated punishments weren't unique to Bohemia. In some parts of the Low Countries, fornicators were placed in hanging baskets lined with nettles. Not enough to injure, but certainly enough to discourage fidgeting. Some had to recite psalms while hanging. Others were simply left to dangle in awkward silence. One German chronicle even mentions a couple who were caught in flagrante and sentenced to be placed in a companion cage, a sort of dual birdcage designed for two. They were suspended over a pond, forced to hold hands until sunset. A floating reminder that intimacy has consequences. Historians still argue whether this was an invented tale, a parable of sorts, or an actual recorded punishment. Some suspect the Pond of Repentance was a later addition, tacked on by a particularly poetic scribe. Still, the imagery lingers. Two sinners swinging gently above the water, hands sweaty and sore, forced into a kind of physical and emotional truce. You picture yourself up there now, swaying ever so slightly, the breeze tugging at your sleeves. Below, children point. An old woman mutters a prayer, someone throws a cabbage. It's oddly peaceful. And here comes your quirky twist of the hour. In 15th century Moravia, a minor nobleman known for his indiscretions was sentenced to ride a wooden goat through town. Not on a goat, a wooden goat. It was wheeled, painted, and had tiny bells on its horns. The man, according to the town records, was deeply displeased, which might be the politest way of saying mortified, but the punishment worked. Not because it corrected his behavior, but because the image stuck. For years afterward, local children played Sir Goat Parade, chasing each other through the market in mock reenactments. The nobleman eventually left the region. The goat stayed. And again, we see that strange medieval marriage of punishment and performance, of justice and jest. You shift in your sleep, trying to decide if these punishments were more about shame or memory. Was the goal to reform, or to ensure you were never forgotten? Because if we're honest, there's something undeniably theatrical about being hoisted above the square in a singing cage. Back in Bohemia, Lucas finishes his tune. The square is quiet. The townspeople disperse, and the bored guard lowers the winch. He steps out, rubbing his neck, and mutters something about sore fingers and bad romance. The priest blesses him with 2 fingers and a shrug. Lucas bows, exaggerated and shameless, and the baker's daughter claps anyway. Because some people, no matter the punishment, still know how to take a bow. By now, the line between dream and memory has softened into something cotton thin. Your mind drifts, and once again, the scenery changes. This time to the sun-drenched hills of medieval Iberia. Spain, late 1200s. The scent of rosemary and dust in the air. Somewhere a lute plinks a sleepy tune, and you're walking quietly toward a public courtyard with a strange wooden device at its center. It looks like a bench. But not quite. It's the cuckold's stool, a curiously specific punishment primarily used not for the adulterers themselves, but for the husbands who were deemed, shall we say, insufficiently vigilant. Yes, in certain regions and time periods, if a man's wife committed adultery, and if he failed to report it, confront it, or control it, he could be punished for her actions. And how? He was placed on a rickety stool in the middle of the square, sometimes with horns affixed to his head, sometimes wearing a crudely painted placard that read, "Cuckold," or something equally flattering, while the townspeople chanted rhymes about goats and wives. Goats again, always goats. Historians still debate the purpose of this ritual. Was it a legitimate punishment, or more of a folk performance to let off communal steam? Some argue it was a way of reinforcing patriarchal control. Embarrass the husband, and the message is clear. Keep your household in order. Others say it functioned like carnival satire, poking fun at male pride in a safely contained context. Whatever its origins, the scene you're picturing now is half farce, half tragedy. The man on the stool scowls, cheeks burning. Children laugh. A woman in the crowd whispers too loudly that his wife always did walk funny on Tuesdays. The punishment lasts an hour. The humiliation? Considerably longer. This kind of punishment was surprisingly widespread, especially in towns where civic and religious life intertwined. In medieval France, the equivalent was sometimes a charivari, a noisy, mocking procession staged by neighbors. If they suspected a man had lost control of his wife, they might gather outside his house banging pots and pans, singing crude songs, and marching a mock donkey in circles. The goal wasn't justice, really, it was ritual correction. A public reminder that sexual order, as they defined it, was everyone's business. It's hard not to wonder how these husbands reacted. Did they feel shame? Rage? Resignation? Did they laugh along, hoping to save face? And what of the wives? Rarely do records mention them directly, but one folktale, passed down in Galician oral tradition, tells of a woman who stood in the crowd during her husband's cuckoldry punishment, arms crossed, expression unreadable. When someone asked if she felt guilty, she allegedly replied, "I do. I'm guilty of not doing it sooner." Sleepy as you are, that line makes you smile. For all the records we have, court scrolls, penitential manuals, bishopric archives, there are gaps. Vast, aching gaps filled with guesses, folk memory, and a healthy amount of medieval sarcasm. Here's a fringe tidbit for your nighttime pondering. In certain rural English towns, women accused of being too flirtatious were tied to a ducking stool, not for full immersion as was done with suspected witches, but just above the water, lowered partway as a warning. It was called a flirt dip. No, really. Imagine being lowered into a pond with your skirts bundled and your dignity trailing behind, all because you smiled too brightly at the wrong candlemaker. And yet, in these punishments, one thing remains consistent. They're performative, public, ritualized. You get the distinct impression that half the town showed up not for justice, but for entertainment. The same way people now scroll before bed, tired, curious, hungry for novelty. Back then, they gathered in cobbled squares for the thrill of someone else's downfall. Punishment as drama. Shame as a sleepy lullaby. As the Iberian sun dips low and the breeze carries the smell of olives and sheep, you start to drift again. The man on the stool has gone home. The horns are left behind, hanging limply from a post. And somewhere nearby, a woman lights a candle. Not for sin, not for sorrow, just for light. Because, as we've seen, sometimes the most radical thing you can do in the medieval world is simply carry on. Somewhere in your half-dream, a rooster crows. You're not sure if it's real or just imagined, until you look around and realize you've arrived in the chilly stone corridors of a monastic compound. The walls are damp with early morning dew. A bell rings in the distance, slow and solemn. You're in the 14th century in Poland, and you're about to witness a punishment not doled out in the marketplace, but in the cloisters. Tonight, it's not peasants or tavern musicians under scrutiny. It's the monks. Yes, even the holy weren't above reproach. Monastic communities had their own rules. Detailed, exacting, and sometimes surprisingly intimate. And when those rules were broken, especially in matters of sexual misconduct, the response was swift and deeply ritualized. you peer into a candlelit chapel where a barefoot monk kneels before the altar, head bowed, hands trembling. He's been caught in carnal familiarity, as the record puts it, likely with a fellow novice or a local servant girl. His punishment? A public confession during lauds, the early morning prayer service wearing a coarse sackcloth robe and a rope collar. No one speaks to him, no one meets his eyes, and that's just day one. Over the next 40 days, he'll fast on bread and water. He'll lie prostrate outside the abbey's refectory during meals, face down in the dirt, as his brothers step carefully around him. Some might bless him, others may not. Historians still argue whether such penances were primarily spiritual corrections, or whether they functioned consciously or not as deterrents through shame. Was the goal true repentance or just institutional discipline disguised as piety? And while you might think monks were exceptions to the performative punishments we've seen in towns and villages, they weren't. In fact, some monasteries staged their own moral theater. In Cluny, France, an abbot once ordered a monk to process through the cloister wearing a donkey tail and a scroll that read, "He who follows the flesh shall graze like a beast." Not exactly subtle, you imagine it now. The solemn columns, the flicker of candlelight on stone, the quiet shuffle of feet as a disgraced brother shuffles by, donkey tail trailing. Even here in these sacred halls, the medieval need for spectacle persists. Of course, not all orders agreed on punishment methods. The Cistercians, known for their severity, favored extended silence and isolation, locking transgressors in small cells called carceres, literally little prisons, where the sinner would reflect on his misdeeds for weeks or months. In contrast, the Franciscans often opted for community-based correction. A brother who sinned might be demoted in rank, asked to clean latrines, or assigned to serve meals with lowered eyes. Still humiliating, just less donkey tail. And here's your fringe nugget for the night. In one particularly unusual Benedictine rulebook, there's mention of a punishment for monks who wrote immodest poetry. Their ink and quills were taken away, and they were forced to copy penitential psalms by memory. If they got a verse wrong, they started over. Imagine that. No snacks, no candle. Just cold fingers, a scratchy robe, and the creeping horror of starting Psalm 51 for the 6th time because you swapped a word. But not all was gloom. Many monks returned from their penances stronger, more focused, sometimes even revered for their endurance. Some kept the rope collar afterward, tucked away as a reminder. Others became stricter abbots themselves, perpetuating the cycle of penance and performance. You shift under your blanket, vaguely aware of your own warmth, your own freedom. No rope around your neck, no psalms to memorize, no donkey tails. Yet somehow you feel connected to these forgotten men in cold corridors, bound by the shared absurdity of human weakness and the ways we try again and again to make sense of it. The chapel door creaks shut, the candle gutters, and as the punished monk sinks into sleep back in his cell, you do too. Knowing that even in cloisters, even behind high stone walls, the medieval world found its way to theatrical judgment. The dream shifts again. Stone walls give way to something altogether different. Soft sand underfoot, a blazing sun above, and the faint rustle of papyrus in the breeze. You find yourself now in Mamluk Cairo, 13th century, where the streets pulse with life. Spice vendors shout over carts of cinnamon and saffron, children chase goats down alleys, and from a shaded courtyard, the low, rhythmic chanting of Quranic recitation echoes softly. But our focus tonight? It's tucked away in the back streets, in a place where wrongdoers are punished not with violence or pillories, but with public performance and deeply layered symbolism. This time, the offense is zina, unlawful sexual relations under Islamic law. The man in question is a textile merchant, caught not in the act but through testimony. Neighbors whispering, a servant confessing, patterns aligning. And now? He walks barefoot through the bazaar draped in women's clothing, bells tied to his wrists, his beard half-shaven. The punishment? A blend of shame and spectacle, carefully calibrated. In Mamluk jurisprudence, the hudud, fixed punishments for zina, could be severe, lashes or stoning in the most extreme cases, but only with 4 adult male witnesses to the actual act. And, as you might imagine, that standard of evidence was rarely met. In most practical cases, the courts leaned into more flexible, discretionary penalties: public shaming, temporary imprisonment, exile. And in Cairo, the theatrics were precise. The idea was not only to punish, but to restore balance, to remind the community of moral expectations without resorting to excessive violence. So, symbolic humiliations were common. A man might be led through the streets on a donkey, backward, while a town crier announced his offense. In one document, a man convicted of seducing a scholar's daughter was made to wear her veil and recite market prices aloud, backwards, under threat of another circuit. Historians still debate whether such punishments were court-mandated or locally improvised. Some believe they originated as customary penalties enforced by neighborhood guilds or religious fraternities, policing their own members quietly without formal legal interference. What's striking is how performative these punishments were. Like medieval Europe, the Mamluk world understood the power of shame in motion. A walking warning, a live cautionary tale. You follow the merchant in your mind's eye. His head is bowed, the bells on his wrists jingling softly with each step. Some people jeer. Others simply watch. A few, perhaps those who knew him, look away in silence. It's hot. The sand bites at his feet, but still he walks. Here's your fringe fact. In some regions under Mamluk influence, a convicted adulterer might be forced to sweep the mosque courtyard for a month, barefoot at prayer times under supervision. It sounds gentle, almost monastic, but in context, it was a deeply symbolic act. He was not only serving the community, but purifying himself, literally and figuratively, 5 times a day. Meanwhile, women accused of similar offenses were often dealt with more privately, especially if they belonged to powerful families. Some were sent to religious retreats, others placed under the supervision of elder women, tasked with spiritual correction. In rare cases, they were married off to distant cousins as a kind of social reset. It's worth pausing here to notice, while the world around them was often unforgiving, medieval Islamic law had multiple mechanisms of mercy. Judges had discretion, communities intervened, and repentance mattered a lot. But of course, none of this stopped the public shaming from being excruciating, especially when bells and veils were involved. The merchant has finished his route now. He sits quietly in a shaded alcove, drinking from a chipped cup of rosewater offered by a child too young to know shame. His eyes are glassy. His hands tremble. But the bells no longer jingle. And just like that, the punishment is done. You turn the corner of your thoughts and the market disappears behind you. Cairo fades into warm darkness. The jasmine-heavy air carries a final whisper that even in the bustling brilliance of Islamic civilization, with all its libraries and scholars and perfumed fountains, justice could still walk the streets in silence, dressed in ridicule, carrying the weight of moral theater. You inhale deeply, no bells, no sandals, just your breath and the stillness of sleep curling at the edges. And now we arrive at the end of our long, winding night. The torchlight flickers low and the echoes of boots and bells and whispered accusations begin to dim. But there's one final stop before we sleep. A quiet one, tucked far from the squares and cathedrals and market parades. You're in a sleepy little German hamlet, sometime in the late 1400s. Snow has begun to fall. Smoke curls from low-roofed cottages, and the town seems wrapped in wool and pine. The world muffled under a thickening hush. In one of these cottages sits a woman, maybe 40, with rough hands and a face weathered by years of bread ovens and brewing pots. Her name's not recorded, but her story survives in a local court roll. She was found guilty of carnal dealings outside the bonds of marriage. A sexual crime, yes, but hardly rare. What made her case different, and why it ended up written down, was the punishment. Instead of a whipping post or pillory, she was given a choice. A 1-week fast with public prayer, or wearing the shame flute. Yes, the shame flute. You probably weren't expecting a musical instrument at this point in the night. But here it is, made of iron, shaped like a recorder or fife, but with clamps instead of keys. It was locked around the neck and fingers so the wearer looked as if they were playing it. Offenders were paraded through the village, mocked not only for their crime, but for their performance. And just to be clear, this wasn't a one-off punishment. The shame flute, or Schandflote, was used across parts of Central Europe for crimes involving lewdness, gossip, or lecherous behavior, both male and female. Historians still argue whether the flute's purpose was strictly symbolic or if it had musical origins. Some versions even had tiny bells that jingled when the wearer moved. A few believe it evolved from actual minstrels' instruments, co-opted by town authorities as tools of ridicule. Either way, the result was the same. A deeply absurd spectacle meant to erode dignity in the gentlest, sharpest way. You picture her now, walking slowly, hands locked in place, her fake flute pointed skyward like some tragic minstrel in a pageant no one asked to join. Children stare, a priest looks away, someone laughs. But she walks with her head high. No song escapes, but something about her posture hums. There's a Fringe account, mostly oral tradition, that one woman punished with the shame flute began to hum deliberately as she walked. A lullaby, wordless, low, and steady. By the time she reached the church, others were humming it too. Was it defiance? Resignation? A kind of healing? Hard to say. But in a world so eager to punish with pageantry, maybe quiet songs were their own form of rebellion. And here, in this final corner of our journey, you begin to feel the full tapestry of it all. The punishments, yes, but also the people. The lives behind the scrolls and verdicts and metal masks. The woman who hummed. The monk who wept. The merchant who sat quietly with his rosewater. They weren't just examples, they were human. Flawed, ordinary, often ridiculous, and occasionally brave. And so we begin to slow. The flute fades. The snow thickens outside that little German house. And with that, we ease into the final wind down. You've made it, through the pillories and parchment, the ducking stools and donkey tails, the bells and veils and shame flutes. And now the world begins to exhale. The noise is gone. The torches have burned out. Even the whispering crowds have returned to their warm hearths, their beds, their own dreams. You're no longer in a medieval square or a dusty market. You're right here, in the quiet dark, wrapped in softness, your body heavier with every breath. What once felt like absurdity now feel strangely gentle, human. The punishments, harsh as they were never just about pain. They were rituals, theater, echoes of a society trying, sometimes clumsily, sometimes cruelly, to draw boundaries around behavior, identity, morality. Some lines made sense, others blurred. Most were forgotten, folded into the long drift of time. But tonight, you follow them. Step by step, gently, without judgment. And now you let go. Let go of the donkey tail. Let go of the iron mask. Let go of the fear of being watched, judged, paraded. There's no crowd here, no sentence. Just the hush of air in your lungs, the cool weight of rest across your chest, and the soft knowing that history, even at its strangest, always has something to teach us. So, close your eyes if they haven't already. Let your thoughts blur like ink on damp parchment. And drift slowly, quietly, into dreams you won't remember. You're safe. You're still. You're free. Good night, end of script. Sweet dreams.